In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the air is thin and death lurks behind every rock, 16 Navy SEALs found themselves trapped in a nightmare that would test everything they believed about brotherhood, sacrifice, and the impossible choices that define heroes. This is the true story of Operation Red Wings, where the silence of a remote valley was shattered by a single rifle shot that echoed across the world, changing the lives of everyone who heard it. Some say war reveals who we really are when everything else is stripped away. On June 28, 2005, in the Hindu Kush Mountains, 4 men would discover just how true those words really were. The helicopter blades chopped through the thin mountain air as Lieutenant Michael Murphy checked his equipment one final time. The MH-47 Chinook flew low through the valleys of the Hindu Kush Mountains, carrying 16 of America's most elite warriors toward what intelligence briefings had called a routine reconnaissance mission. Murphy touched the Street Christopher medallion around his neck, a gift from his mother before his deployment. He had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, that medallion would be covered in blood and dirt clutched in the hands of a dying hero. Sitting across from Murphy, Petty Officer Marcus Luttrell adjusted the straps on his pack. At 6'5" and built like a linebacker, Luttrell had survived the brutal training that turned ordinary men into Navy SEALs. But nothing in that training had prepared him for what awaited in the mountains ahead. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Intelligence reports indicated that Ahmad Shah, a high-ranking Taliban leader responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, was hiding in a village near the Pakistan border. Their job was simple: get in, observe, and report back on Shah's location and activities. The third member of the reconnaissance team, Petty Officer Danny Dietz, was busy studying satellite photographs of their target area. At 25, Dietz was known for his technical expertise and his ability to stay calm under pressure. His wife, Maria, was expecting their first child, and Dietz carried her photograph in his breast pocket. He had promised her he would be careful, that this deployment would be different from the others. As the helicopter banked sharply around a mountain peak, Dietz wondered if he should have made a promise he might not be able to keep. The fourth man in the reconnaissance team was Petty Officer Matthew Axelson. Known to his teammates as Axe, he was the quiet professional who never complained and never quit. Axelson had joined the Navy to see the world, but the world he had seen was mostly viewed through the scope of a rifle or from behind the cover of rocks and sandbags. He believed deeply in the mission, in protecting American lives, and in standing by his brothers no matter what the cost. That belief would be tested in ways he could never imagine. The mission briefing had been conducted in a secure tent at Bagram Air Base just hours before takeoff. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Christensen, the officer in charge of the operation, had outlined the intelligence they had received about Ahmad Shah. The Taliban leader was believed to be planning a major offensive against coalition forces, and locating him was critical to preventing American casualties. The reconnaissance team would be inserted at night, observe the target area during the day, and be extracted after gathering the necessary intelligence. What the briefing did not mention was how many things could go wrong in the mountains. The terrain was some of the most challenging in the world, with steep cliffs, dense forests, and valleys that seemed to swallow radio signals. The Taliban knew these mountains better than any American force ever would. They had been fighting in these hills for decades, first against the Soviets, then against each other, and now against the Americans. For them, every rock and tree was familiar territory. As the Chinook approached the insertion point, the aircrew chief signaled that they were 10 minutes out. The SEALs conducted their final equipment checks with the practiced efficiency that comes from years of training. Each man carried approximately 60 pounds of gear, including weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, and survival supplies. They wore night vision goggles and carried suppressed weapons to maintain stealth during the insertion. The insertion point was located on a ridge overlooking the Shuriek Valley, where intelligence indicated Shah's village was located. The plan called for a night insertion followed by a movement to an observation post that would allow them to monitor the village during daylight hours. If Shah was present, they would call on additional forces to capture or eliminate him. If he was not present, they would gather intelligence on his organization and potential hiding places. Murphy reviewed the mission timeline once more as the helicopter began its descent. They would be on the ground for approximately 24 hours before being extracted by helicopter. During that time, they would maintain radio silence unless they observed the target or encountered an emergency situation. The extraction helicopter would arrive at a predetermined location and time, regardless of whether they had completed their mission or not. The Hindu Kush Mountains had been a crossroads of conflict for centuries. Alexander the Great had fought battles in these valleys. The British Empire had lost entire armies trying to control these peaks. The Soviet Union had deployed over 100,000 troops and still failed to pacify the region. Now American forces were learning the same lessons that history had taught so many others. The mountains did not surrender easily to anyone. As the helicopter settled into a hover above the insertion point, the SEALs prepared to fast rope down to the ground. The ridge was narrow and rocky, surrounded by steep drops on three sides. It was the kind of terrain that offered excellent observation positions, but limited escape routes. In military terms, it was both advantageous and dangerous, providing clear fields of view while leaving few options if things went wrong. The fast ropes dropped from the helicopter, and the four SEALs descended into the darkness below. Murphy was the first to touch ground, followed by Luttrell, Dietz, and Axelson. They immediately moved away from the insertion point and took defensive positions while the helicopter departed. The sound of rotor blades faded into the distance, leaving them alone in the mountains with only the wind and the distant sounds of night creatures for company. Once the helicopter was out of sight and sound, the team began their movement toward the observation post. They moved carefully through the darkness, using night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain. The observation post was located approximately 2 kilometers from the insertion point, positioned to provide clear views of the village while maintaining concealment from enemy forces. The movement took over 2 hours due to the difficult terrain and the need to maintain absolute silence. Every step had to be calculated to avoid dislodging rocks that might alert enemy forces to their presence. They communicated through hand signals and moved in single file, with Murphy leading and Luttrell bringing up the rear. The weight of their equipment made every step more challenging, but they maintained their pace through sheer determination and training. When they reached the observation post, they found it exactly as described in the intelligence briefing. A cluster of large boulders provided natural concealment while offering clear views of the valley below. The village was visible in the distance, a collection of mud brick buildings clustered around a small stream. Smoke from cooking fires drifted up from several compounds, indicating that the village was occupied and active. The team established their observation position and settled in for what they expected to be a long day of watching and waiting. Murphy positioned himself where he could observe the village while maintaining radio contact with headquarters. Dietz set up his communications equipment and prepared to photograph any significant activity. Axelson and Luttrell established security positions to watch for approaching threats from other directions. As dawn approached, the village began to show signs of activity. Women emerged from compounds to collect water from a stream. Children appeared in the narrow streets, playing games and chasing goats. Men gathered in small groups, drinking tea and talking. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other rural village in Afghanistan. But the SEALs were watching for specific indicators that would reveal the presence of Taliban forces. Throughout the morning, they observed normal village activity without any sign of Ahmad Shah or his fighters. The intelligence briefing had indicated that Shah often traveled with a security detail of armed men, but no such group was visible in the village. The SEALs photographed the buildings and documented the activities they observed, building a detailed picture of the village's daily routine. By midday, the sun was beating down mercilessly on their position. The temperature climbed above 90 degrees, and the rocks around them became too hot to touch with bare skin. They rationed their water carefully, knowing that they needed to remain hydrated while making their supplies last until extraction. Each man carried 3 quarts of water, which would have to sustain them for the entire mission. It was during the afternoon heat when everything changed. Dietz was adjusting his camera position when he spotted movement on the ridge above their position. 3 figures were moving slowly down the slope, driving a small herd of goats ahead of them. They were local herders, probably moving their animals to different grazing areas. Under normal circumstances, encountering civilians would not pose a significant threat to the mission. But these were not normal circumstances. The herders were moving directly toward the SEALs' position, and there was nowhere to hide. The observation post that had seemed so perfectly concealed now felt like a trap. The team had to make a decision quickly. They could attempt to remain hidden and hope the herders passed by without seeing them, or they could reveal themselves and deal with the consequences. Murphy made the decision to remain concealed and hope for the best. The team pressed themselves against the rocks and waited as the herders approached. The sound of bleating goats grew louder, and voices could be heard speaking in Pashto. The herders were closer now, close enough that the SEALs could see their faces clearly. One was an elderly man with a gray beard, another appeared to be a teenager, and the third was a boy who could not have been more than 14 years old. The goats wandered directly into the SEALs' position, forcing the herders to follow. Within minutes, the civilians were standing less than 10 feet from the hidden American soldiers. There was no way to remain concealed any longer. Murphy slowly raised his hands to show he was not a threat, and the other SEALs followed his lead. The herders' eyes widened in shock and fear as they realized what they had stumbled upon. The elderly herder spoke first, his voice trembling as he tried to communicate with the Americans. None of the SEALs spoke Pashto fluently, but Murphy knew enough to understand that the man was asking who they were and what they were doing in the mountains. The situation had gone from routine reconnaissance to potential catastrophe in a matter of seconds. Murphy faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Military protocol called for the detention or elimination of anyone who might compromise the mission. The herders had seen American Special Operations Forces in a concealed position, and they knew the general location of the observation post. If they were allowed to leave, they might alert Taliban forces to the SEALs' presence. If they were detained, the team would have to abandon their mission and call for immediate extraction. The third option was one that Murphy could not bring himself to consider, despite its tactical advantages. The herders were unarmed civilians, including a child. They posed no immediate threat beyond their knowledge of the SEALs' presence. Murphy looked at his teammates and saw his own moral struggle reflected in their faces. They were warriors trained to kill America's enemies, but these were not enemies. They were simply people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The debate was brief, but intense. Luttrell argued that they should detain the herders and call for extraction. Dietz suggested that they could move to a different position and continue the mission. Axelson remained silent, waiting for Murphy to make the command decision. As the team leader, the choice was ultimately his to make. Murphy made his decision based on the values that had guided him throughout his life and military career. He would not authorize the killing of unarmed civilians, especially a child. The herders would be released, and the team would deal with whatever consequences followed. It was a decision based on honor rather than tactics, morality rather than military expediency. The herders were allowed to gather their goats and continue on their way. They moved quickly down the slope, occasionally looking back at the Americans with expressions of fear and confusion. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the valley below, leaving the SEALs alone with their equipment and their uncertainty about what would happen next. Murphy immediately began planning for contingencies. If the herders alerted Taliban forces, the team could expect to be surrounded within hours. Their position would be compromised, and they would need to move to a more defensible location or call for immediate extraction. The mission to observe Ahmad Shah's village was effectively over, but their fight for survival was just beginning. The herders had been gone for less than an hour when Murphy's worst fears began to materialize. Through his binoculars, he could see unusual activity in the village below. Men were gathering in groups, pointing toward the mountains, and several figures could be seen running between buildings. The peaceful morning routine had been replaced by something that looked very much like military preparation. Dietz was monitoring radio frequencies when he picked up increased chatter on Taliban communication channels. Although he could not understand all of the Pashto being spoken, the tone and urgency were unmistakable. The herders had reached the village and reported their encounter with American forces. Now, the mountains that had seemed so vast and empty were about to become very crowded with people who wanted to kill them. Murphy gathered his team for a quick planning session. Their original mission was compromised beyond recovery, and their primary concern now was survival and extraction. The nearest helicopter landing zone was over 3 kilometers away, across some of the most difficult terrain in Afghanistan. They would have to move quickly while carrying all of their equipment, and they could expect to be pursued by Taliban fighters who knew the mountains far better than they did. The team began preparing to move when Luttrell spotted the first signs of immediate danger. On the ridge opposite their position, roughly 800 meters away, he could see figures moving deliberately through the rocks. They were not herders or civilians going about their daily business. These were armed men, moving tactically, and they appeared to be searching for something specific. Axelson confirmed the sighting through his rifle scope. He counted at least 6 men, all carrying weapons, moving in a formation that suggested military training. They were too far away for accurate rifle fire, but they were definitely approaching the SEALs' general area. More troubling was the fact that they seemed to know where to look, as if they had been given specific information about the Americans' location. Murphy made the decision to move immediately rather than wait for the Taliban fighters to get closer. The team quickly gathered their equipment and began moving toward the extraction point. They moved as quietly as possible while maintaining a pace that would get them to safety before being overtaken by their pursuers. Each man carried approximately 60 pounds of gear, making movement over the rocky terrain slow and exhausting. The escape route took them down a steep slope covered with loose rocks and thorny vegetation. Every step threatened to send them tumbling down the mountainside, and the noise of dislodged stones seemed incredibly loud in the mountain silence. They moved in single file, with Axelson leading and Murphy bringing up the rear to watch for pursuit. After 30 minutes of difficult movement, they reached a temporary position where Murphy decided to check their situation. Using his binoculars, he scanned the ridge they had just left and felt his heart sink. The Taliban fighters had reached their former observation post and were now spreading out in a search pattern. Even more alarming was the sight of additional figures appearing on adjacent ridges. What had started as a small group of 6 men was rapidly becoming a much larger force. Dietz attempted to establish radio contact with headquarters to request immediate extraction, but the mountains were interfering with their communications. The radio crackled with static, and despite multiple attempts, he could not get a clear signal through to their base. They were alone in the mountains with a growing number of enemies closing in on their position. The team continued moving toward the extraction point, but their pace was slower than Murphy had hoped. The terrain was working against them, forcing them to navigate around cliffs and through narrow passages that channeled their movement in predictable directions. It was exactly the kind of terrain that favored defenders who knew the area over attackers who did not. As they rounded a boulder-strewn ridge, Luttrell spotted movement ahead of their position. Taliban fighters had somehow moved around them and were now blocking their route to the extraction point. The Americans were being herded into a kill zone, surrounded by enemies who had the advantage of numbers, terrain knowledge, and preparation time. Murphy realized that their situation had gone from dangerous to desperate. They were cut off from their planned extraction point, surrounded by an unknown number of enemy fighters, and unable to communicate with friendly forces. The mountain peaks that had seemed like protection were now working against them, creating a natural prison with limited escape routes. The first shots came without warning. A burst of automatic rifle fire echoed off the mountain walls as Taliban fighters opened fire from a position above and to their right. The bullets struck the rocks around the SEALs, sending fragments of stone flying through the air. The team immediately took cover behind the largest boulders they could find and began returning fire. Murphy's training took over as he assessed their tactical situation. They were pinned down in a natural bowl surrounded by higher ground. The enemy had the advantage of elevation and covered positions, while the SEALs were exposed on relatively open ground. Their only advantages were superior training, better equipment, and the desperate motivation that comes from fighting for survival. Dietz continued trying to establish radio contact while the firefight developed around him. Between bursts of enemy fire, he could hear the static-filled voices of American pilots and ground controllers, but he could not get a clear signal through to request immediate assistance. The mountains that provided such excellent concealment for special operations also blocked the radio signals that could save their lives. The Taliban fighters were using classic guerrilla tactics, firing from concealed positions, and then moving to new locations before the SEALs could return effective fire. They seemed to have an unlimited amount of ammunition and were not concerned about conserving their shots. The sound of gunfire echoed continuously through the valley, punctuated by the distinctive crack of bullets striking rock. Axelson was the first to spot a Taliban fighter trying to flank their position. The enemy soldier was moving carefully through the rocks about 200 meters to their left, attempting to get into a position where he could fire down on the trapped Americans. Axelson lined up his shot carefully and squeezed the trigger, watching through his scope as the fighter fell and did not move again. The death of their comrade seemed to enrage the Taliban fighters rather than discourage them. The volume of fire increased dramatically, and Murphy could hear voices shouting in Pashto from multiple directions. They were completely surrounded now, with enemies firing from positions above, below, and on both sides of their defensive position. Luttrell took a bullet in the leg during one of the enemy attacks, but he continued fighting despite the pain and bleeding. The wound was not life-threatening, but it limited his mobility and reminded all of them how precarious their situation had become. They were running low on ammunition, had no way to call for help, and faced an enemy force that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. As the firefight continued, Murphy began to realize that their only hope for survival was to reach a position where their radio would work. The extraction point was now impossible to reach, but there might be other locations where they could establish communication with friendly forces. The problem was that any movement would expose them to enemy fire from the elevated positions surrounding them. During a brief lull in the shooting, Murphy explained his plan to the team. They would attempt to break out of their current position and move to higher ground where their radio might work better. It was an extremely dangerous plan that would require them to cross open ground under enemy fire, but staying in their current position meant certain death as the Taliban fighters closed in around them. The breakout began when Axelson provided covering fire while the other 3 SEALs moved toward a ridge that might offer better radio reception. The plan worked initially, with the team making good progress under Axelson's protective fire. But as they reached the base of the ridge, Taliban fighters appeared directly in front of them, blocking their escape route with a wall of automatic weapons fire. Murphy made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the battle. Instead of falling back to their previous position, he led the team up the ridge directly into the enemy fire. It was a move born of desperation rather than tactics, but it was their only chance to reach a position where they might be able to call for help. The climb up the ridge was a nightmare of loose rocks, thorny vegetation, and constant enemy fire. Dietz took a bullet in the shoulder, but kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death for all of them. Murphy was hit in the back, but continued climbing, leaving a trail of blood on the rocks behind him. When they reached a small ledge about halfway up the ridge, Murphy made the decision that would seal his fate. The radio still was not working from their current position, but he could see a spot higher up that might provide the clear line of sight needed to establish communication. The problem was that the spot was completely exposed to enemy fire, offering no cover whatsoever. Without telling his teammates what he was planning, Murphy climbed out onto the exposed ridge with his radio and satellite phone. Taliban fighters immediately concentrated their fire on his position, and bullets struck the rocks all around him as he attempted to establish contact with headquarters. He managed to get through to a radio operator at Bagram Air Base and began transmitting their location and the desperate nature of their situation. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was enough to alert American forces that the reconnaissance team was in serious trouble and needed immediate assistance. Murphy provided their GPS coordinates and estimated enemy strength before a Taliban bullet found its mark and knocked him backward off the ridge. He had completed the radio call that would bring help, but at the cost of his own life. Luttrell watched in horror as his team leader fell, but there was no time to grieve. The Taliban fighters were pressing their attack from multiple directions, and the remaining 3 SEALs were running dangerously low on ammunition. They had to find a more defensible position or they would be overrun within minutes. The team began moving again, this time with Luttrell leading despite his leg wound. They were heading for a cluster of large boulders that might provide better cover, but the movement exposed them to fire from every direction. Dietz took another bullet, this one more serious than the first, and began falling behind the others. Axelson turned back to help his wounded teammate, providing covering fire while Dietz struggled to keep moving. The 2 men were working together, supporting each other through the rocky terrain, when a burst of automatic fire caught them both. Axelson went down first, and Dietz fell beside him moments later. Both men continued firing from their prone positions, but their wounds were severe and their movements were becoming increasingly limited. Luttrell found himself alone, separated from his teammates by 50 meters of open ground swept by enemy fire. He could see Dietz and Axelson still moving, still fighting, but he could not reach them without crossing terrain that was completely dominated by Taliban positions. The firefight had become a series of individual battles, with each SEAL fighting for survival from whatever cover he could find. The sound of gunfire was now continuous, echoing off the mountain walls and creating a deafening cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Luttrell could hear Taliban fighters shouting to each other as they maneuvered for better firing positions. They were methodical and patient, taking their time to ensure that none of the Americans would escape alive. As the afternoon wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate for the surviving SEALs. They were outnumbered by at least 20-1, wounded, low on ammunition, and cut off from any possibility of escape. The Taliban fighters seemed to have an endless supply of fighters and weapons, with new groups arriving throughout the day to join the battle. Dietz made one last attempt to reach a better position, crawling through the rocks despite multiple wounds. Taliban fighters spotted his movement and concentrated their fire on his location, ending his struggle in a hail of bullets that echoed through the valley. His death left only Luttrell and the wounded Axelson still fighting against overwhelming odds. The sun was beginning to set when Axelson made his final stand. Surrounded by Taliban fighters who were closing in on his position, he fought with everything he had until his ammunition ran out. Even then, he continued to resist, using his rifle as a club until he was overwhelmed and killed. His last radio transmission was a simple message: "Tell my family I love them." Luttrell was now completely alone, wounded, and surrounded by enemies who had been hunting him for hours. The mountains that had seemed so beautiful in the morning light had become a killing ground where 3 of America's finest warriors had made their final sacrifice. But the battle was not over yet, and help was finally on the way. Marcus Luttrell lay bleeding behind a boulder, listening to the sounds of Taliban fighters moving through the rocks around him. His 3 teammates were dead, killed in a firefight that had lasted most of the day. He had multiple wounds, including a broken back from a fall down a mountainside, but he was still alive and still armed. The question was how much longer he could survive against the dozens of enemy fighters who were systematically searching the area for him. The radio call that Lieutenant Murphy had made before his death had reached the Rescue Operations Center at Bagram Air Base. Within minutes of receiving the distress signal, military commanders had begun assembling a rescue force to extract the surviving members of the reconnaissance team. The problem was that the nearest available aircraft was over an hour away, and the Taliban fighters showed no signs of giving up their search. Back at Bagram Air Base, Lieutenant Colonel Eric Christensen was coordinating the rescue effort from the Tactical Operations Center. The same officer who had briefed the reconnaissance team on their mission was now working frantically to save any survivors. He had 16 of his best men either dead or missing in the mountains, and he was determined to bring them home regardless of the cost. The rescue force consisted of 2 MH-47 Chinook helicopters carrying a total of 16 additional SEALs and Army Rangers. The aircraft were heavily armed and crewed by some of the most experienced special operations pilots in the military. Their mission was to land at the coordinates Murphy had transmitted and extract any survivors from the reconnaissance team. The flight to the rescue site took the helicopters over some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. Taliban forces throughout the region had been alerted to the ongoing battle, and several surface-to-air missile teams had been positioned along the likely flight routes. The rescue pilots were flying into what intelligence analysts described as the most heavily defended airspace they had encountered during the entire war. As the helicopters approached the target area, the pilots could see the smoke and dust from the ongoing firefight below. Taliban muzzle flashes were visible on multiple ridges, indicating that a significant battle was still in progress. The rescue force would be landing directly into an active combat zone, where they would be immediately surrounded by enemy forces. The lead helicopter, call sign Turbine 33, began its approach to the landing zone that Murphy had designated in his final radio call. The crew chief could see Taliban fighters moving through the rocks below, and tracer rounds were already beginning to streak past the aircraft. The pilot maintained his approach despite the increasing enemy fire, determined to reach the landing zone where American lives might depend on his courage. Luttrell heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors and felt a surge of hope that he had not experienced since the beginning of the firefight. The rescue force was coming, and if he could survive long enough to reach the landing zone, he might actually make it out of the mountains alive. The problem was that he was still surrounded by Taliban fighters, and any movement toward the landing zone would expose him to enemy fire. The sound of approaching helicopters also alerted the Taliban fighters to the incoming rescue attempt. They immediately began repositioning their forces to intercept the aircraft and prevent any successful extraction. Radio chatter intercepted by American intelligence indicated that Taliban commanders were calling in additional fighters from throughout the region to join the battle. As Turbine 33 settled into a hover over the landing zone, the crew chief lowered the ramp and prepared for the rescue team to fast rope down to the ground. The helicopter was taking heavy fire from multiple directions, with bullets striking the aircraft's armor and shattering windows in the cockpit. Despite the intense enemy fire, the pilot held his position while the rescue team prepared to deploy. The rescue team leader, Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Healy, was the first man down the rope. He had been handpicked for this mission because of his experience in mountain warfare and his reputation for never leaving a man behind. As his boots touched the rocky ground, he immediately came under fire from Taliban positions on 3 sides of the landing zone. Before the rescue team could establish a defensive perimeter, disaster struck in the form of a rocket-propelled grenade fired from a concealed position on the ridge above the landing zone. The RPG struck Turbine 33 in the aft section, causing a massive explosion that immediately brought the aircraft down. All 16 men aboard the helicopter were killed instantly, including the rescue team and the air crew. The explosion of Turbine 33 could be heard for miles through the mountain valleys. Luttrell watched in horror as the helicopter that was supposed to save him disintegrated in a ball of fire and smoke. The wreckage scattered across the mountainside, eliminating any hope of immediate rescue, and adding 16 more names to the casualty list for what had started as a routine reconnaissance mission. The second helicopter, Turbine 34, was forced to abort its approach when the crew saw their sister aircraft go down. Taliban fighters were now firing at them from prepared positions all around the landing zone, and several more surface-to-air missiles have been launched in their direction. The pilot made the difficult decision to return to base rather than risk the lives of his crew and passengers in what had become an impossible rescue attempt. News of the helicopter crash reached Bagram Air Base within minutes, stunning the commanders who were coordinating the rescue operation. In less than 24 hours, they had lost 20 American Special Operations personnel in a single incident. It was one of the worst single-day losses in the history of American Special Operations forces, and it was still not over. Luttrell was now completely on his own, wounded, and surrounded by an estimated 80 Taliban fighters who were conducting a methodical search for any survivors. The wreckage of the crashed helicopter had provided them with additional weapons and ammunition, and they were in no hurry to end their hunt. They knew that any surviving Americans would eventually have to move, and when they did, they would be killed. The Taliban fighters were using a classic hunting technique, establishing a series of observation posts and gradually tightening their search pattern. They had all night to find Luttrell and they were confident that no wounded American could evade capture for very long in terrain they had known since childhood. What they did not know was that Luttrell had grown up hunting in the East Texas forests, and he understood how to remain hidden even when badly wounded. As darkness fell over the Hindu Kush Mountains, Luttrell began planning his escape. He could not stay in his current position because the Taliban fighters would eventually find him. He could not call for help because his radio had been damaged in the fighting. His only option was to move through enemy territory to reach an area where he might be found by friendly forces or sympathetic locals. The movement began just after midnight, when cloud cover provided additional concealment from any Taliban fighters who might be using night vision equipment. Luttrell crawled away from his hiding place, moving slowly and quietly through the rocks and vegetation. Every few meters, he stopped to listen for sounds that might indicate enemy movement in his direction. The Taliban fighters had expected him to try to escape during the night, and they had positioned teams along the most likely escape routes. Twice during his movement, Luttrell came within meters of enemy positions without being detected. His survival depended on remaining absolutely silent and moving only when he was certain that no one was watching his location. The escape route took him down a steep ravine filled with loose rocks and thorny bushes. Each step was agony because of his injuries, and the sound of dislodged stones seemed incredibly loud in the mountain silence. But he continued moving, driven by the knowledge that capture meant torture and death, while movement offered at least a small chance of survival. After several hours of movement, Luttrell reached a small stream at the bottom of the ravine. The water was ice-cold from mountain snow, but it helped to ease his thirst and clean some of his wounds. More importantly, it provided a natural route away from the immediate battle area and toward the lower elevations where he might find help. Following the stream required him to move through open areas where he would be visible to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. But it also led him away from the Taliban's search teams, which were concentrating their efforts in the rocky terrain where they expected to find him. The stream became his lifeline, guiding him through the darkness toward an uncertain but hopefully safer destination. As dawn approached, Luttrell found himself in a different valley, several miles from the scene of the previous day's battle. He was still in Taliban territory, but the immediate threat had diminished. The sound of gunfire had stopped, and he could no longer hear the voices of enemy fighters searching for him. For the first time in over 12 hours, he began to believe that he might actually survive. The sun was rising when Luttrell encountered the first local civilians since the herders who had originally compromised their position. An elderly Afghan man was walking along the stream, probably checking irrigation channels for his fields. The man spotted Luttrell immediately and approached him with obvious concern for his condition. The encounter could have gone either way. The civilian might have been sympathetic to the Taliban and could have alerted them to Luttrell's location. Or he might have been one of the many Afghans who were simply trying to survive in a country torn apart by decades of war. Luttrell was too weak to run and too injured to fight, so he had no choice but to trust in the man's humanity. The civilian's name was Muhammad Ghalab, and he made a decision that would save Luttrell's life. Instead of turning him over to the Taliban, Ghalab helped the wounded American to his feet and began leading him toward his village. It was a decision that violated Taliban law and put Ghalab's entire family at risk, but it was also consistent with Pashtunwali, the ancient code of honor that required providing protection to anyone who sought refuge. The walk to Ghalab's village took several hours, with the Afghan villagers supporting Luttrell's weight and helping him navigate the difficult terrain. They moved carefully, avoiding areas where Taliban fighters might be patrolling and staying to paths that were less likely to be observed from the surrounding hills. Every step was a gamble that they would not be spotted by enemies who had already killed 19 American soldiers. When they reached the village, Ghalab brought Luttrell to his home and immediately began treating his wounds with whatever medical supplies were available. The villager's wife and children were initially frightened by the presence of an American soldier, but they followed their husband's lead in providing whatever assistance they could. For the first time since the battle began, Luttrell was safe and receiving medical care. The safety was temporary, however. Taliban fighters were still searching for him, and they would eventually extend their search to the surrounding villages. Ghalib knew that hiding an American soldier was punishable by death under Taliban law, but he also knew that Pashtunwali required him to protect his guest regardless of the personal cost. It was a conflict between fear and honor won. That night, as Luttrell lay recovering in Ghalib's home, the sound that would change everything echoed across the valley. It was the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by shouting and the sound of vehicles moving through the village streets. The Taliban had found them, and they were coming to claim their prize. The final phase of the battle for Marcus Luttrell's life was about to begin. The rifle shot that cracked through the night air was not aimed at Marcus Luttrell or any of the villagers who were hiding him. Instead, it was a warning shot fired by Muhammad Ghalib's nephew, who had been watching the approaches to the village for Taliban fighters. The young man had spotted a group of armed Taliban moving along the ridge above the village, and his shot was a signal to the other defenders that the enemy was approaching. What Luttrell did not know, and what would have amazed him if he had understood it fully, was that the entire village had made a collective decision to protect him. Word of the wounded American's presence had spread quickly through the small community, and the village elders had met to discuss what should be done. Under Pashtunwali, the ancient code of honor that governed tribal behavior, they were obligated to provide protection to anyone who sought refuge, regardless of the personal cost. The decision to protect Luttrell was not made lightly. Everyone in the village knew that harboring an American soldier would bring swift and brutal retaliation from the Taliban. They had seen what happened to villages that defied Taliban authority, and they understood that their choice might result in the destruction of their homes and the death of their families. But they also understood that some things were more important than personal safety. Ghalib had explained the situation to his brother, Nasrallah, who served as the village Malik or leader. Nasrallah was a man in his 60s who had seen the Soviets come and go, witnessed the civil wars that followed, and lived through the rise of the Taliban. He understood better than most what they were facing, but he also understood that abandoning a wounded man would violate everything their culture held sacred. The village had perhaps 40 adult men capable of fighting, along with a small collection of aging rifles and limited ammunition. They faced an estimated 80 Taliban fighters who were better armed, better trained, and highly motivated to capture or kill the American soldier. It was a battle they could not win through conventional means, but they had advantages that the Taliban did not fully appreciate. The first advantage was terrain. The village was located in a narrow valley with steep sides, accessible by only two main routes. The villagers had lived in this location for generations, and they knew every trail, every hiding place, and every defensive position that might provide cover from enemy fire. They could use the terrain to channel Taliban attacks into areas where their limited firepower would be most effective. The second advantage was motivation. The Taliban fighters were motivated by ideology and the promise of reward for capturing an American. The villagers were fighting for their homes, their families, and their honor. They had nowhere to retreat and no option of surrender, because defeat would mean the destruction of everything they held dear. The third advantage was time. The Taliban fighters needed to capture Luttrell quickly, before American rescue forces could arrive in the area. The villagers only needed to hold out long enough for help to arrive, or for the Taliban to decide that the cost of continued fighting was too high. It was a race against time, with the survival of an American soldier and an entire Afghan village hanging in the balance. The Taliban attack began just before dawn, with a coordinated assault from both ends of the valley. The fighters moved carefully, using the pre-dawn darkness to conceal their approach and positioning themselves to maximize their firepower advantage. They expected the village to surrender immediately when faced with overwhelming force, as most communities had done in similar situations. The first Taliban fighters to reach the village outskirts were met with rifle fire from concealed positions among the buildings. The villagers had prepared defensive positions during the night, using their knowledge of local terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. The initial Taliban assault was repelled, but everyone knew it was just the beginning of a much longer battle. Nasrallah had positioned his defenders to take advantage of every piece of cover the village provided. Men were hidden behind stone walls, in doorways, and on rooftops where they could fire down on attacking forces. The women and children had been moved to the safest buildings, while the elderly men who could still handle weapons were given positions where they could contribute to the village's defense. Luttrell wanted to help with the fighting, despite his injuries and weakened condition. He understood that these people were risking their lives to protect him, and he felt obligated to contribute whatever he could to their defense. But Ghalib firmly refused to allow him to leave the house where he was hidden, knowing that his presence in the fighting would only make him a more obvious target for Taliban fighters. The battle developed into a siege, with Taliban forces surrounding the village and maintaining constant pressure on the defenders. They used classic insurgent tactics, firing from concealed positions and then moving to new locations before the villagers could return effective fire. The sound of gunfire was constant throughout the morning, echoing off the valley walls and creating a din that could be heard for miles in every direction. The Taliban fighters had expected the village to surrender within hours, but the defenders showed no signs of giving up. Every attempt to advance into the village was met with determined resistance, and several Taliban fighters had been killed or wounded in the failed assaults. The siege was lasting much longer than anticipated, and Taliban commanders were beginning to worry about the arrival of American rescue forces. By midday, the situation had reached a stalemate. The Taliban forces controlled the high ground around the village, but could not advance into the settlement without taking heavy casualties. The villagers controlled the buildings and streets, but could not break out of the valley to seek help from outside. Both sides were running low on ammunition, and both knew that something had to change if the battle was going to be resolved. The change came in the form of additional Taliban reinforcements arriving from other parts of the region. Word of the battle had spread throughout the Taliban network, and commanders had decided that capturing or killing the American soldier was worth a significant investment of resources. By mid-afternoon, the Taliban force had grown to over 150 fighters, completely overwhelming the village's defensive capabilities. The increase in Taliban strength was immediately apparent to the village defenders. The volume of incoming fire doubled, and Taliban fighters began advancing from multiple directions simultaneously. It became clear that the villagers could not hold their positions much longer without suffering catastrophic casualties. The end of the siege was approaching, and it did not look good for the defenders. Ghalib made a desperate decision to try to save both Luttrell and his village. He would attempt to sneak the American soldier out of the village during the height of the battle, when Taliban attention was focused on the fighting rather than on possible escape routes. It was an incredibly dangerous plan that would require them to move through Taliban positions in broad daylight, but it was their only remaining option. The escape attempt began during the heaviest fighting of the day, when Taliban forces were launching coordinated attacks from 3 different directions. Ghalib led Luttrell through a series of irrigation ditches and drainage channels that provided concealment from enemy observation. They moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate Taliban fighters in their vicinity. They had covered about half the distance to the valley entrance when they were spotted by a Taliban patrol that was moving to block possible escape routes. The fighters immediately opened fire, forcing Ghalib and Luttrell to take cover behind a low stone wall that provided minimal protection from the incoming bullets. They were pinned down in the open, with Taliban fighters closing in from multiple directions. Luttrell was preparing to make a final stand when the sound that had started this phase of the battle was heard again. Another rifle shot cracked across the valley, but this time it was different. This shot was followed immediately by others, and the distinctive sound of American weapons could be heard mixing with the Taliban gunfire. A rescue force had finally arrived, and they were engaging Taliban positions throughout the valley. The arriving Americans were members of a ranger company that had been searching for Luttrell since the helicopter crash 2 days earlier. They had been following Taliban radio chatter and the sounds of gunfire to locate the battle, and they arrived at precisely the moment when their intervention would be most effective. The Rangers immediately began establishing a security perimeter around the village while calling in close air support. The arrival of American forces changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Taliban fighters who had been advancing on the village suddenly found themselves under attack from behind, caught between the village defenders and the arriving Rangers. The sound of American aircraft could be heard approaching, and Taliban commanders knew that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The first American helicopter to arrive was an Apache gunship that immediately began engaging Taliban positions with rockets and 30mm cannon fire. The helicopter pilots could clearly see the Taliban fighters who were attacking the village, and they methodically began destroying enemy positions one by one. The sound of exploding rockets mixed with the crack of rifle fire as the battle reached its climax. Within 30 minutes of the Rangers' arrival, the Taliban fighters began withdrawing from the area. They had lost too many men to continue the attack, and the presence of American aircraft made their positions untenable. The siege of the village was over, but the cost had been high for both sides. Several villagers had been killed defending their homes, and Taliban casualties were estimated at over 40 fighters. Luttrell was evacuated by helicopter to a military hospital, where he began the long process of recovering from his physical and psychological wounds. His survival was due entirely to the courage of Muhammad Ghalib and the villagers who had risked everything to protect him. Without their intervention, he would have been captured or killed within hours of reaching their valley. The village paid a heavy price for their decision to protect an American soldier. Taliban forces returned several times in the following months, destroying homes and threatening anyone who had participated in Luttrell's protection. Several villagers were forced to flee their homes, and Ghalib himself eventually had to seek refuge in the United States because of continued Taliban threats against his family. The battle for the village had lasted less than 2 days, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It demonstrated the courage of ordinary people who chose to do what was right despite overwhelming odds. It showed that honor and humanity could survive even in the midst of a brutal war. And it proved that sometimes the sound of a single rifle shot could indeed change everything. The story of what happened in that remote Afghan village spread throughout the American military and beyond. It became a testament to the power of human compassion and the bonds that can form between people who might otherwise be enemies. But for Marcus Luttrell, it was simply the reason he was still alive when everyone said he should be dead. Marcus Luttrell's rescue helicopter touched down at Bagram Air Base on a dusty afternoon that marked the end of one of the most devastating single operations in Navy SEAL history. As medical personnel rushed to transfer him to the base hospital, Luttrell carried with him not only physical wounds that would take months to heal, but also the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that would prove far more difficult to treat than any bullet wound or broken bone. In the sterile white rooms of the military hospital, Luttrell underwent surgery after surgery to repair the damage inflicted during his ordeal in the Hindu Kush Mountains. He had a broken back, multiple gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and severe dehydration. But the physical injuries were only part of the story. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of Michael Murphy, Danny Dietz, and Matthew Axelson, and he heard the sound of the helicopter explosion that had killed 16 more American heroes. The debriefing process began as soon as Luttrell was medically stable enough to provide detailed information about what had happened during Operation Red Wings. Intelligence officers, military investigators, and SEAL commanders spent hours going through every detail of the mission, trying to understand how a routine reconnaissance operation had turned into such a catastrophic loss of life. Luttrell answered their questions with the clinical precision that his training had instilled in him, but each retelling of the story reopened wounds that had nothing to do with Taliban bullets. Back in the United States, the families of the fallen SEALs were struggling to come to terms with their losses. Maureen Murphy had lost her son Michael, the team leader who had sacrificed his life to make the radio call that brought help. Daniel Murphy Sr. found himself trying to understand how his son's decision to spare the lives of 3 Afghan herders had ultimately led to his death and the deaths of 19 other American servicemen. In Littleton, Colorado, Daniel Dietz Sr. and Cindy Dietzmarsh were planning a funeral for their son Danny, the SEAL who had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian before he decided to serve his country instead. Their grandson, whom Danny would never meet, was born just weeks after his father's death in the mountains of Afghanistan. The child would grow up hearing stories about a father who died fighting for his brothers and his beliefs. In California, Matthew Axelson's family was struggling with the loss of their quiet, determined son who had joined the Navy to see the world and ended up dying on a mountainside halfway around the globe from home. His parents, Donna and Cordell Axelson, would spend years trying to understand why their son had to die in a place most Americans could not find on a map, fighting people who hated everything America represented. The 16 men who died in the helicopter crash left behind wives, children, parents, and siblings who would never fully recover from their losses. Some had been days away from returning home after completed deployments. Others had volunteered for the rescue mission despite being scheduled for leave. All of them had died trying to save 4 men they had never met, bound together by the brotherhood that defines Special Operations Forces. The investigation into Operation Red Wings revealed a series of small decisions and chance encounters that had combined to create a perfect storm of tragedy. The mission planning had been sound, the intelligence had been accurate, and the execution had followed established procedures. But the encounter with the herders had set in motion a chain of events that no amount of training or preparation could have prevented. The decision to release the herders rather than detain or eliminate them became a source of intense debate within the military community. Some argued that Murphy's choice had been tactically unsound and had directly led to the deaths of 19 American soldiers. Others maintained that the decision had been morally correct and that the mission's failure was due to bad luck rather than poor judgment. Luttrell found himself at the center of this debate as the only surviving witness to the team's decision-making process. He defended Murphy's choice consistently and vigorously, arguing that killing unarmed civilians, including a child, would have violated everything they had sworn to protect. The debate would continue for years, with no clear resolution to the moral and tactical questions it raised. As news of the operation became public, the families of the fallen warriors found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had never sought. The story of Operation Red Wings captured the public imagination in ways that most military operations did not, perhaps because it illustrated so clearly the human cost of the war in Afghanistan. The names Murphy, Dietz, and Axelson became synonymous with heroism and sacrifice in the minds of many Americans. Muhammad Ghalib and his family were facing their own struggles in the aftermath of the battle. Taliban forces had returned to their village multiple times, seeking revenge for the protection the villagers had provided to the American soldier. Houses were burned, livestock was stolen, and several villagers were beaten or killed for their role in Luttrell's rescue. The ancient code of Pashtunwali that had motivated their actions was now putting their lives in constant danger. Ghalib himself became a marked man, targeted for assassination by Taliban leaders who viewed his actions as a betrayal of their cause. He was forced to move his family multiple times, seeking refuge in different villages and eventually in larger cities where his identity might be less well known. The man who had saved an American life was now struggling to save his own family from the consequences of his compassion. The story of Ghalib's heroism gradually became known to American officials, who began working to bring him and his family to the United States. The process was complicated by bureaucratic obstacles, security concerns, and the general chaos that surrounded Afghan immigration issues. It would take years of effort by Luttrell and others to finally secure safe passage for the man who had risked everything to protect an American soldier. In the months following his rescue, Luttrell began the difficult process of returning to active duty. His physical recovery was complicated by the severity of his injuries, but his psychological recovery proved even more challenging. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and a deep depression that threatened to overwhelm him despite the best efforts of military medical professionals. The decision to retire from active duty was not an easy one for Luttrell. The Navy SEALs had been his life for over a decade, and his identity was deeply intertwined with his role as a special operations warrior. But the physical and psychological toll of Operation Red Wings had left him unable to meet the demanding standards required of active duty SEALs. His military career was over, but his mission to honor his fallen teammates was just beginning. Luttrell's book about the operation, Lone Survivor, became a bestseller and brought the story of Operation Red Wings to millions of readers around the world. The book was his attempt to ensure that the sacrifices of Murphy, Dietz, Axelson, and the 16 men who died in the helicopter crash would not be forgotten. It was also his way of dealing with the survivors' guilt that haunted him every day. The book's success led to a Hollywood movie that brought the story to an even wider audience. While the film took some dramatic liberties with the actual events, it succeeded in introducing a new generation of Americans to the courage and sacrifice of Special Operations Forces. For many viewers, it was their first real understanding of what military service meant in the post-September 11 world. The legacy of Operation Red Wings extended far beyond books and movies. Lieutenant Michael Murphy was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, for his heroic radio call that brought rescue forces to the area. Petty officers Dietz and Axelson were awarded the Navy Cross, and all three men had ships, buildings, and other facilities named in their honor. The Lone Survivor Foundation, established by Luttrell and others, began providing support to wounded veterans and their families. The Foundation's work extended the mission of Operation Red Wings beyond the mountains of Afghanistan, helping other warriors who had been wounded in service to their country. It was a way of turning tragedy into purpose and loss into a force for positive change. Years after the operation, Luttrell and Ghalib were finally reunited in the United States, where the Afghan villager and his family had been granted asylum. The reunion was emotional for both men, who had shared an experience that few others could truly understand. Ghalib's presence in America served as a living reminder that even in the midst of war, human compassion and moral courage could triumph over hatred and violence. The village where Luttrell had been protected eventually rebuilt what the Taliban had destroyed. Life returned to the valley, though the scars of the battle remained visible for years. Some of the villagers who had participated in Luttrell's protection were forced to flee their homes permanently, but others remained, continuing the ancient traditions that had motivated their actions during those crucial days. The debate over the moral and tactical aspects of Operation Red Wings continued within military circles and beyond. Some argued that the mission had failed because of poor planning or inadequate support. Others maintained that it had failed because of bad luck and the inherent risks of special operations in enemy territory. But most agreed that the courage displayed by all involved, both American and Afghan, represented the best of human nature under the worst of circumstances. For Marcus Luttrell, the operation that had cost him his teammates and nearly his life became the defining event that shaped the rest of his existence. He carried their memory with him every day, honoring their sacrifice through his own continued service to veterans and their families. The sound of that first rifle shot in the mountains continued to echo in his memory, but it was accompanied now by other sounds. The voices of the children who had been helped by the foundation established in his teammates' honor, the applause of audiences who heard their story, and the quiet thanks of families who had been touched by their legacy. The mountains of Afghanistan, where Operation Red Wings took place, remained dangerous long after the battle ended. Other American soldiers would fight and die in those same valleys, pursuing an enemy that seemed as permanent as the rocky peaks themselves. But the story of what happened there in June 2005 became part of military legend, a reminder that heroism could be found in the most unlikely places and that brotherhood transcended nationality, religion, and culture. The crack of that remote rifle firing had indeed changed everything, marking the beginning of a battle that would claim 20 American lives and countless Afghan ones. But it had also marked the beginning of a story that would inspire millions, a testament to the power of human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In a world often divided by hatred and misunderstanding, the bonds formed between an American soldier and an Afghan villager proved that some things remain universal: honor, compassion, and the willingness to risk everything for a stranger in need.